Although Chinese food is one of the favorite cuisines in the United States, how many people have heard of Hakka cuisine? Stay tuned and find out about this delicious subject.
Welcome to The Better Part, a program that encompasses a diverse spectrum of topics important to our community, which we hope will both inform and entertain you. We invite you to sit back and enjoy the program.
Our guest today, Linda Lau Anusasananan, worked as a food writer and recipe editor for Sunset Magazine for 34 years. After retiring from Sunset, Linda went on a quest in search of her Hakka cultural and culinary heritage. The result was, to the delight of food lovers everywhere, a remarkable book called The Hakka Cookbook, Chinese Soul Food from Around the World. Welcome, Linda. First, tell us, who are the Hakka people? Can you give us a brief history?
Well, Grace, the words Hakka mean guest family. And some people think of them as the nomads or the gypsies of China. And that's because they had no land to call their home for many, many centuries. It started in the 4th century, and invaders enforced the Hakka out of their home in north-central China. And they gradually migrated south, and eventually they settled in the southern part of China and in scattered communities all over the world. Now the Hakka, because they always arrived to occupied lands last, they were usually considered unwelcome migrants. People didn't really like them. All the good pieces of land were taken, so all they had were the scraps. So the Hakka had to adapt. They worked really hard, and they were able to survive where other people had failed.
Since the Hakka have immigrated to far-flung regions of the world, where did you decide to start your journey of discovery?
Well, first we went to China, and here in this slide, we accidentally found my father's ancestral home. And in this photo, my brother is pointing to our family name, which is the character on the right side, which is Lao in Cantonese or Liu in Hakka. So I wanted to go to China because I wanted to see what the cuisine was like at the original place. We went to China. We went to Meizhou, which is sort of the Hakka heartland in southern China in Guangdong province. And also in the surrounding area, Fujian is also considered part of that heartland. We went to Chengdu, a little Hakka village outside of Chengdu in Sichuan province, and Beijing, to Hong Kong and Taiwan, and to Singapore and Malaysia. I went to Peru and Hawaii, New York, and Toronto. And when I got to Toronto, I had hit the pot luck because there I found that there were Hakkas who had come from all over the world. They had migrated there. And they came from Jamaica and Trinidad and India and Mauritius and Australia and Suriname. And so there was a potpourri of Hakka right there.
So they have migrated to so many different countries and areas of the world. How were you able to pick these particular countries?
Well, when I had done my research, and I had found that Hakka had gone to many scattered communities, and I wanted to sort of follow the footsteps of the Hakka diaspora. So I chose some of the areas where there was a concentration of Hakka population, and some of it was, you know, like a happy accident. I went to New York, and I had a friend who happened to take me to a sort of Hakka Indian restaurant, and I realized the owner was Hakka, And then I also met a filmmaker from Toronto who told me that he had a lot of Hakka friends back in Toronto, and he introduced me to one person who introduced me to a whole circle of Hakkas who had come from all over the world.
Tell us about some of the stories that you heard in your travels.
Well,
there must be a lot of them.
Yeah, you know, everywhere I went, I would ask people about their history and their stories. Natalie Lou Com from Lima, Peru. Natalie was born in Peru, but she went back to China when she was about 2 years old. 20 years later or so, she married a Hakka man who had come from Peru, and she came back to Peru. She worked for her husband's import firm in the 1950s, but she also learned how to cook from his business partner. And in 1975, she really shocked the community because she was one of the first women to open a Chinese restaurant in Lima, Peru. Mm. Now, in our next slide, this is Anthony Lin. I met him in Toronto. He originally came from India. He got into the restaurant business when he was only 12. He followed his mother to Canada, and he opened the Danford Dragon. Now, this restaurant is located in Toronto's Greek town. They created a fusion cuisine of Chinese ingredients and stir-fry techniques, and they merged it with Indian spices, and that created a very spicy cuisine that the Indians loved. Now, another person I met is Winston Chang with his daughter Melanie. Now, Winston originally came from Trinidad. He now lives in Toronto. He calls himself a Hakkaologist. He made this up himself. I'm not sure if that's a real word, but because he really studied the Hakka culture in his own family background, and which resulted in a couple of books. And he could trace his family back 200 generations to one man in China who created the Chang village. Winston's father, who was a school teacher, came over to Trinidad in 1938. And his father originally worked for a cocoa trader. And his first job was to polish cocoa beans. He did this by dancing barefoot over the beans.
Oh, my goodness.
So later he became a entrepreneur. He married a local Cantonese woman. Their family grew and they became shopkeepers. And in the West Indies, many of the Hakka were shopkeepers. And that really dictated their lifestyle and what they ate, because what they ate was really what didn't sell in the stores.
Oh.
But in 1962, I believe, when Britain granted Trinidad their independence, their opportunities and the political situation really diminished for the Chinese. So they left, many left, and they went to Toronto for a new future and a new life. So those are just some of the stories that I met and some of the people.
Oh, they're fascinating stories. So what was your decision process for writing this book, and what was your inspiration?
My inspiration was my grandmother. We called her Popo, and she came to live with us when we were small children. And although she was only 4'10", she soon became the matriarch in our family. I think of her, she's really a true Hakka woman, a hard worker. She was very practical. She was a feminist. She was very smart with her money. She invested in real estate as soon as the law permitted that. And she was painfully honest. And Popo used to tell us, you should be proud you're Hakka. Well, my brother and I, we were the only kids of color in an all-white school. We really didn't care about learning how to be more Chinese or more unique. What we really wanted to do was fit in.
Where was this?
We lived in a small town in Northern California called Paradise. And but Popo insisted, so she taught us we had Chinese classes after our regular school day. And she would teach us how to write Chinese characters and to read Chinese books. I have to admit that a lot of it did not stick. But, decades had passed. And after Paul and my parents had passed away, and then I had worked at Sunset Magazine for those 34 years. I had left a job recently, and I thought, I could find out what Paul meant. What did she mean when she said, "You should be proud you're Hakka"? And so I thought it was an opportunity for me to do that, and I would do it through what I knew best, which would be food. And as I started my research and started interviewing people, I also realized that most of these recipes and stories were residing with the older generation. It was with the grandmothers. It was with the people who were in their 60s, 70s, and 80s. And most of their young relatives and children had no inkling of how to cook these recipes. And I began to think, I really do need to sort of record these recipes and the history and the culture for people like me and for the future generations to know, more about their culinary history.
Right. It sounds like your Popo was way ahead of her time.
I didn't realize it at the time, but in a way she was. But I also found this character with other Hakka women. With the Hakka, the women are known for being extremely strong and hardworking. And there's this saying, if you marry a Hakka woman, you'll never have to work. It's probably true.
Is that right?
I think it is.
So did you discover information that surprised you?
Oh, yes, I did. Well, one thing is, I didn't realize there were so many Hakka. I've found that there were 75 million Hakka who reside all over the world. Now, growing up, admittedly, I grew up in an all-white town. I knew hardly any Hakka except our own family. But even when I moved to the Bay Area, I really found most people were Cantonese. I didn't know very many Hakka. And actually, throughout my life, I had never really heard of many Hakka people until I started research for this book.
So what are some of the characteristics of Hakka cuisine? Can you describe it to us?
Well, I would say the cuisine is very much like the people themselves. It's traveled the world and has had to adapt to new homes, which means that sometimes it has to incorporate new ingredients. It has to adjust to the local taste, and sometimes it invents new dishes, such as maybe this noodle dish that we see in this slide. I ate this dish in Singapore, and the chef had said that many of his younger customers wanted something a little bit lighter. So this dish is basically stir-fried pork and Chinese chives and lots of mushrooms, stir-fried with some soy sauce and put over a bed of noodles and bean sprouts.
Are you able to eat the same dish in different parts of the world, and did it taste pretty similar?
Many times, yes. Sometimes I was very surprised that a dish that I ate in Peru tasted like something that my grandmother would make, or maybe I ate in China, which brings me back to what I consider it kept this traditional roots. This surprised me the most. No matter where it was, even though there were these changes in the cuisine and it had expanded because of migration, it still kept its traditional roots. And you might say, what is the traditional definition of Hakka food? And I kind of think of it as a food of the working man, a sort of comfort food for the soul. It's very hearty and satisfying, and it sometimes uses cured meats and preserved vegetables and soy sauce. These give it kind of a strong, robust flavor. But yet there are also other dishes in the cuisine that balance that strong flavor. We see the peas and squash. It emphasizes the natural essence of the ingredients. It's very pure and natural. It has fresh ginger and it's pan steamed with that. So it's very plain with just an accent of ginger. Now you also see some lily bulbs. We had that in China, and you can find that sometimes in Asian markets. But it's not essential. You can use shallots or just leave them out.
So a dish like this would bring out the natural flavors of the vegetables.
Yeah. Now, also, some people call Hakka cuisine the country cousin of Cantonese cuisine, because the Hakka and the Cantonese lived in the same province, so they were neighbors. And there was a lot of borrowing between both groups. So there are a lot of dishes that will remind you of Cantonese home cooking. Now, other people define the cuisine by classic Hakka dishes that are the most famous. And this slide here shows one of them, moi choi kyo-yuk, or some of the Cantonese call it kao-yuk. It is pork belly steamed with preserved mustard greens in a dark, savory sauce until the pork becomes melted and succulent. It is kind of the epitome, I would say, of the Hakka taste, and it's a favorite of many people. Another dish that we see in the next slide is the stuffed tofu, and that is really a dish of migration, invented through migration. Because when the Hakka moved from their home in the north, they came to the south, they wanted to make the dumplings that they had eaten in the north. They couldn't find the wheat flour in the south to make the wrappers. So they got inventive, and they took the filling and they stuffed it into chunks of tofu. Usually the Hakka version always contains pork. But when they went to areas near the sea, they sometimes added seafood. But the Cantonese version usually contains only like a fish paste. This slide shows salt-baked chicken. Now this is probably a well-known dish attributed to the Hakka. I've heard a couple stories about how it was created. One is that they had no way to cook their chicken, so they dug a pit and lined it with hot rocks and salt and put the chicken in there. I met this chef in Beijing, and he said, I think it was created by a very smart Hakka salesman who happened to sell salt. And because this recipe uses a lot of salt, you bury the chicken in salt, and then you turn it in the salt. That chef in Beijing rubbed it with seasonings, wrapped it in paper, and then put it in a pan loaded with salt and cooked it over direct heat, and then turned the chicken occasionally. There's variations on that dish that are more common in restaurants and at home cooks. They do it kind of a little cheating, easier version where they just rub the chicken with salt and they steam it, or they poach in the salt water, and it comes out sort of like that Cantonese white cut chicken, and the skin is white and the flesh is very smooth and succulent. And they call it, salt steamed chicken.
I'm getting hungry. What are some regional specialties?
One is called Lu Cha, which means pounded tea or thunder tea. And we see in this slide Amy Wong, and she lives in Kuala Lumpur. She's showing me the equipment you use to make this pounded tea. And basically, it's a giant mortar and pestle. It's a big bowl and a stick. What she does is she takes fresh green herbs like mint and basil and cilantro, dry tea leaves and nuts and seeds, and she pounds them into a paste. And then we can see in the next slide, she takes boiling water and makes this green tea. Now she pours that green tea over a bowl of garlic rice that's topped with stir-fried greens and peanuts and tofu, and she mixes it all together, and you eat it and you feel fabulous. This dish is supposed to cure all your ailments. It is really a health food dish. One thing I did want to show you first was maybe this one other dish, which was pun choi in Hong Kong, the new territories of Hong Kong. And it is basically a multi-course banquet that is layered in one big wash basin.
My goodness.
And when we saw that, our eyes really popped open.
Yes.
Now, you were talking about how I figured out how to
compile
the
this
recipes.
book. Yeah. Because there's so many to choose from.
The first thing I did was go to China. And I thought it was important that I go where the food originated. And I had learned from a previous trip when I had worked at Sunset Magazine in 1987. I had done a research scouting trip to China, and I had only taken my photographer with me. There were only 2 people. So we had banquets, like 2 banquets within 5 hours of each other. Couldn't possibly eat the food, all the food, and we left so much behind. I felt so guilty. So this time when I went to China, I brought 10 other people with me, mostly family, connected, had Hakka connections usually. And we ate at a lot of restaurants. And you can see in this particular side, we're in Lodi, a Hakka village outside of Chengdu. When I usually go to restaurants, I take a lot of notes. I take a lot of photographs. And then when I go home, I try to recreate the dish from my notes. Now here in Singapore, we have my preferred way of getting recipes is to watch the people actually cook the recipe. And here these 3 sisters in Singapore had cooked a Hakka lunch for me. And there I could watch them. I took a lot of notes and came home and also tried to recreate them.
Let me ask you about the book. It's beautifully illustrated by your brother, Alan Lau, who's a talented artist and poet. But what made you decide not to include any photographs of the food?
You know, it's not always the author's decision. You know, color photographs to put in a cookbook are very, very expensive to put in. And I knew that the idea for my cookbook itself was not like a mainstream idea. I would have a very hard time to sell that book anyway. And I did. Took me a long time to get it.
Right?
Yeah, it took me a very long time to find a publisher because they want books that I think are more mainstream and they think will sell a lot of books. So I had a artist in the family, and he had come to China with me, and he had a lot of paintings that he had already done from the trip. And I thought it was a good way to showcase his art to a larger audience. And also, I thought the art was more timeless than photographs. I had worked with color photographs at Sunset a long time. And over the years, I realized how quickly photographs get dated by the props, by the style. And I wanted this book to be more of a book that would be what we call evergreen, that would last a long time. And I thought that art would hold up better.
It's beautiful, absolutely lovely. And in 2012, you received a tremendous honor. You tied for first place for the best Chinese cuisine cookbook in the world, presented by the Gourmand World Cookbook Awards in Paris. What were you feeling when you heard your name announced?
Well, I was shocked. And my husband was even more shocked. He almost forgot to take photos. But I was, and of course I was very surprised and pleased, but I was surprised because my book I would consider a dark horse in the group of finalists. There were 5 finalists, the one from China, which was a beautiful, I would call it a coffee table book with gorgeous color photos, lots of white space, beautiful paper, very big format. It's not a book that I don't think people would actually cook from. They would leave it on their coffee table and thumb through it. And there was a book from Britain and a book from Australia. Those two books were similar in they were about home cooking. They both had color photographs, and they were quite, beautiful books too. The third book was one from France that was published by a museum that talked about recipes, but a lot of it was about history and the dishes and that. And mine, I'm really not sure why it won, but I suspect maybe because it was a little bit off the beaten track, and it was maybe more unique, that maybe it got the attention of the judges. I don't care. I was happy.
I bet you were. And do you have any plans for any future books?
Well, it took me so long and so much work to do the first book. I don't really have any plans right now. You have to be, if I found a subject that I felt compelled to write about, then I might do that. But if it isn't something like that, because of the work and the time commitment, it's not worth doing.
Well, congratulations on this cookbook, and thank you so much for being with us today. It's been such a pleasure.
Well, thank you, Grace, for inviting me.
I hope you've enjoyed our program today, and remember to watch our shows on YouTube. Thank you for being with us. Bye-bye.